In the quiet halls of a West Virginia VA hospital, elderly veterans started collapsing without warning. One by one, they were rushed into emergencies they would never survive, and all of it traced back to a night shift nurse's aide named Retta Mays. Retta Phyllis Mays was born in 1975 in Reynoldsville, West Virginia. She grew up in a rural community. In November 2000, she joined the West Virginia Army National Guard. Her first service lasted only a few months, ending in April 2001. She returned to the Guard in February 2003. This time she was deployed to Iraq and Kuwait with the 1092 Engineer Battalion. After completing her service, she began working as a corrections officer at North Central Regional Jail in Greenwood, West Virginia. She worked there from 2005 until 2012. In 2013, an inmate filed a lawsuit claiming that Mays and other officers had repeatedly mistreated him. However, the case was later dismissed. Between July 2017 and June 2018, Mays worked as a nursing assistant at the Louis A. Johnson VA Medical Center in Clarksburg. During this period, several elderly veterans under her care began experiencing sudden and unexplained drops in blood sugar. Investigators later discovered that Mays had been giving these patients injections of insulin, even though many of them did not need it. This caused severe medical emergencies, and in several cases, the patients passed away. The hospital had already noticed a pattern of unusual health events in Ward 3A, where Mays usually worked overnight shifts. After concerns grew, Mays was removed from her position in June 2018, and the case was handed over to federal authorities. The investigation was very detailed. It included more than 300 interviews and the review of thousands of medical records. Authorities also found that Mays had searched online for information about female offenders who targeted patients. She had also watched a Netflix series called Nurses Who Kill, which included an episode about insulin-related cases. Phone records revealed conversations with her husband, who was incarcerated at the time. In those calls, she expressed frustration and even mentioned wanting to harm some of the patients. These findings, along with the medical evidence, eventually led to her arrest on July 14, 2020. On May 11, 2021, Retta Mays admitted guilt to 7 counts of second-degree homicide and 1 count of attempting to cause serious harm. During the sentencing, Judge Thomas Klee described Mays as the monster that no one sees coming. She received 7 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each patient who lost their life, plus an additional 20 years for the attempt to harm another patient named Posey. She was also ordered to pay $172,624.96 in restitution. This money was directed to the families, the VA hospital, Medicare, and insurance companies. At her sentencing, Mays expressed regret. She said, "There are no words I can say that would offer the families any comfort. I can only say that I'm sorry for the pain I caused the families and my family." She is now serving her time at the Federal Correctional Institution in Aliceville, Alabama. This facility is a low-security prison for women. Now, what happens when the hero at a hospital turns out to be the cause of destruction? Kristen Heather Gilbert was born in 1967 in Fall River, Massachusetts. She was the older of 2 daughters. Neighbors described her home as an ordinary suburban household. Her father, Richard, worked in electronics. Her mother, Claudia, stayed home most of the time but also did some part-time teaching. On the surface, everything looked normal, but people who knew Kristen later said that she showed troubling behavior from a young age. She often told lies. She could be manipulative. She sometimes created emotional drama that felt extreme. Friends from school and even some relatives remembered moments when she threatened to harm herself or made aggressive threats toward others. There was even a time when she staged what people described as a fake attempt of ending her own life, hoping to manipulate a former boyfriend. That pattern of behavior later showed up again in her adult life. Kristen graduated from Groton-Dunstable Regional High School. In 1984, she began studying nursing at Bridgewater State College, but psychiatric issues disrupted her training. She switched schools several times, moving between Mount Wachusett Community College and Greenfield Community College. She finally completed her nursing diploma in 1988. That same year, she married Glenn Gilbert. They went on to have 2 sons, but the marriage ended in divorce in 1998. Even while she was building a family and career, her behavior often looked unstable. Co-workers and family members later recalled times when she admitted herself to psychiatric hospitals. Sometimes this happened several times in a single year. She usually stayed only for short periods before being released. In 1989, Kristen started working as a staff nurse at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. At first, She seemed like a good nurse. She responded quickly in emergencies and handled routine care without problems. But over time, some staff noticed something unusual. During her shifts, there seemed to be more patients experiencing sudden cardiac arrests. At first, other nurses made jokes, calling her an angel of death because so many patients passed away on her watch. But as the numbers grew, that joke turned into real concern. Investigators later said that Kristen was creating these emergencies. Prosecutors claimed she injected large amounts of epinephrine into patient IV bags. Epinephrine, when used properly, helps the heart. But in very high doses, it can cause the heart to go into dangerous rhythms and even stop working. After triggering a crisis, Kristen would then respond to the code. She often took charge of the resuscitation and sometimes even performed it herself. Prosecutors said this made her appear like a capable and heroic nurse, even though she was the one who created the emergency in the first place. Investigators later connected her to several specific patient losses and a larger group of unexplained emergencies. They also showed statistical evidence. Kristen was on duty during about half of the roughly 350 patient losses recorded while she worked there. Experts estimated the chance of that happening randomly was 1 in 100 million. The court, however, only tied her directly to a smaller number of cases, while leaving many others under suspicion. The confirmed victims in the case included Stanley Jagodowski, Henry Huden, Kenneth Cutting, and Edward Squira. Authorities also said she caused heart failures in other patients who survived. Outside of the hospital, she had been linked to other troubling incidents. In the late 1980s, there was a physical dispute in Greenfield, Massachusetts, that involved her. By the mid-1990s, staff at the VA also suspected her of trying to poison a patient. In 1996, several nurses noticed more cardiac arrests happening, along with missing supplies of epinephrine. The hospital began an internal review. Evidence suggested that medication supplies had been tampered with, and the case was referred to federal investigators. During this time, Kristen tried to stop the investigation by calling in a bomb threat to the hospital. She was later convicted for that act, which prosecutors said was an attempt to intimidate staff and disrupt the inquiry. She was eventually arrested in 1998 and charged federally because the acts took place on federal property. At trial, prosecutors presented medical records, evidence of medication tampering, and testimony from colleagues. Her former boyfriend, James G. Perot, who worked as a VA security officer, also testified. He said that Kristen had admitted over the phone, while staying in a psychiatric hospital, that she had ended at least one patient's life. Prosecutors argued that her motive was attention. They said she created emergencies so she could be the one to save patients, which made her look skilled and heroic, especially in the eyes of Perot, whom she wanted to impress. Her defense argued otherwise. They said most patients were already very sick. They argued natural causes could explain the patient losses. They also pointed out that not every case had direct physical evidence tying Kristen to it. On March 14, 2001, the jury found her guilty of 3 counts of first-degree unlawful loss of life, 1 count of second-degree unlawful loss of life, and 2 counts of attempted unlawful loss of life. During sentencing, prosecutors asked for the highest penalty available under federal law, but the jury decided on life in prison. On March 27, 2001, she was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole, plus 20 additional years. Kristen was first sent to a women's prison in Framingham, Massachusetts, then later transferred to the Federal Medical Center, Carswell, in Fort Worth, Texas, which houses female inmates with medical needs. Over the years, she filed several appeals. Families of victims also filed civil cases, arguing that the VA failed in its supervision and oversight. The case left a lasting mark on the VA hospital system. Many people were unsettled by the idea that someone trusted to save lives could use medical knowledge to harm instead. Hospitals responded by tightening medication handling, improving inventory controls, and encouraging staff to speak up when they noticed unusual patterns. For families of the victims, the guilty verdicts brought some closure but could not undo the losses. The record still shows confirmed cases, suspected cases, and unanswered questions. Kristen Gilbert remains in federal custody, and her case is still discussed in conversations about patient safety, medical ethics, and accountability in healthcare. Now, how could a 5-year-old living on a U.S. Army base be subjected to months of hidden torment without anyone stepping in? Delilah Williams lived on Wheeler Army Airfield in Honolulu, Hawaii. She and her husband, Army Specialist Naeem Williams, were both stationed there. Public records and court files do not show an exact military rank for Delilah, but she was connected to Army housing and the base community. The couple had a daughter named Talia. She was 5 years old when she passed away. Talia lived with Delilah and Naeem while they were assigned to the island. Court records and testimony later showed that Talia's situation was not the result of a single mistake. It was a long pattern of harsh treatment that began after the family arrived in Hawaii. Evidence in federal court showed that, from at least December 2004 until July 16, 2005, Talia was repeatedly punished in severe ways. Prosecutors described many acts. She was often hit and whipped with belts and other objects. She was tied with duct tape to a bedpost. At times, she was forced to do hard physical exercises, and when she could not continue, she was struck again. Basic items were removed from her room, leaving her to sleep on the bare floor. Testimony also described periods when she was denied food, and shocking moments when she was ordered to eat her own waste. These were not rare events, but regular experiences for her. Several specific incidents were recorded in the files. On July 16, 2005, hours before her passing, Talia was reportedly struck so hard that her head hit the floor. She appeared to go into a seizure. Medical evidence later showed large bruises across her body and other injuries that matched repeated blunt force harm. When paramedics arrived, she was unresponsive. Investigators later confirmed that her passing was due to injuries suffered from this long pattern of aggressive behavior. This evidence and expert testimony became central to the government's case. Delilah's case moved more quickly than Naeem's. In December 2006, she made a deal with federal prosecutors. She admitted guilt to first-degree felony charges for her part in the mistreatment and the events that caused Talia's passing. Parts of her plea papers were sealed by the court because they contained detailed descriptions that might affect Naeem's right to a fair trial. As part of the deal, Delilah agreed to testify against Naeem. She was later sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Prosecutors relied heavily on her testimony when moving forward with the case against him. Naeem's case took place in federal court since the events happened on military property. That gave the federal government jurisdiction. In April 2014, a jury found Naeem guilty on several counts. These included felony charges and participating with Delilah in the long pattern of harm from December 2004 to July 16, 2005. He was also found guilty of obstruction of justice and lying to investigators. In June 2014, the jury gave their verdict. A penalty phase followed, but the jurors could not reach agreement on whether to impose a capital sentence. Because of that, it was not applied. On February 6, 2015, Judge J.X. Peen Michael Seabright sentenced Naeem to life in prison with no chance of parole. The case was investigated and prosecuted by federal agencies, including the FBI and the Army Criminal Investigation Division. During trial, Delilah gave detailed testimony, sometimes admitting to her own actions. She described times when she stomped on Talia or struck her in other ways. She also spoke about breakdowns in her marriage that added to the physicality at home. Naeem, in his testimony, claimed that some punishments were because of Talia's bathroom accidents. He also blamed marital frustrations for his actions. The jury, however, rejected those explanations, given the repeated and severe nature of the harm. The case also raised questions about whether people on the base or in Army programs had seen warning signs but did not act. Later, Talia's biological mother brought a civil case, arguing that Army personnel had missed chances to step in. Records showed that some base staff and others had noticed troubling signs or heard about possible issues, but reports and follow-up did not result in Talia being removed from the home. This led to criticism about how child protection was handled on military bases. U.S. Senator Mazie Hirono later used Talia's case to call for stronger protections for children on military installations. She argued for better reporting and cooperation between agencies to prevent situations like this from happening again. There were also consequences outside of the criminal trials. Talia's mother filed a wrongful lawsuit against the federal government, claiming they failed to protect her daughter. She argued that the Army had failed to protect her daughter despite clear warning signs. In 2015, a federal court awarded her a judgment of $2 million against the United States. The court found that the Army had been aware of problems but failed to intervene. This ruling acknowledged that the government carried some responsibility for what happened inside the household. Next is a very different twist. Amy Betro was born in 1979 in West Allis, Wisconsin. She studied childhood development and later trained in graphic design. Early in her career, she worked in sports administration and also tried DJing as a side pursuit. By most accounts, she lived a fairly ordinary life in the United States before becoming involved in a plot that crossed international borders. The events that drew her into this situation began with a dispute in Birmingham, England. In July 2018, a quarrel broke out at Seher Boutique, a clothing shop owned by Aslat Mahmoud. Two men, Mohammed Aslam and his son, Mohammed Nabil Nazir, were involved in that quarrel. They left injured after a fight that reportedly started over the cost of a wedding suit. This argument grew into a bitter feud between the families. Over the following months, the hostility deepened into a plan by Aslam and his son to seek revenge. Nazir began using an online dating app where he started a relationship with Betro. She traveled to the United Kingdom in December 2018 to meet him and spent Christmas there. She returned to the United States in January 2019, but kept in contact with him. Over time, Nazir and his father decided they wanted payback against Muhammad, or a member of his family. They involved Betro in their plan. Prosecutors later said Nazir handled much of the preparation. He helped Betro get access to a firearm and arranged communication methods. Betro went back to the United Kingdom in late August 2019, officially as a tourist. In the days before the planned action, she checked into a hotel in Birmingham and purchased 2 temporary mobile phones. On September 4, 2019, she met Nazir in Derby and test-fired the handgun that would later be used in Birmingham. On September 7th, she bought a used Mercedes and drove to the Yardley area in East Birmingham. Surveillance cameras later shown in court recorded her leaving the hotel in a summer dress, buying the car that same morning, and driving through streets near the target's home. That evening, as the shop owner's son, Sikandar Ali, arrived home, Betro stepped out of the Mercedes. She wore a niqab to hide her identity. She walked up close to Ali and tried firing the weapon. It jammed. Ali scrambled back into his car and drove away, clipping Betro's Mercedes as he escaped. Betro left the area and abandoned the car nearby. Hours later, she returned in a taxi. She fired multiple rounds into the family home, including shots that went through a bedroom window. She then left and fled the United Kingdom within days. After leaving the country, Betro went back to the United States and later traveled again, eventually settling in Armenia. While on the run, she and Nazir worked on a second plan to mislead investigators. They mailed ammunition and weapon parts to the United Kingdom in an attempt to frame an innocent person. That effort failed and drew even more attention from investigators. Authorities later uncovered evidence that linked Betro to the parcels. Phone and surveillance records also placed her in the right places at the right times. The investigation that followed was large and international. West Midlands Police in the UK led the inquiry, working with agencies abroad. Detectives relied on surveillance footage, mobile phone data, financial and travel records, postal analysis, and DNA testing to build the case. Among the key evidence was a black glove found in the abandoned Mercedes that contained Betro's DNA. There was also video of a handgun being tested on land near Derby, records of temporary phones, and surveillance footage of Betro near the family's home. This evidence became the backbone of the case. In June and November 2024, a separate trial in Birmingham convicted Mohammed Nabil Nazir and Mohammed Aslam for their involvement. Nazir received a long prison term, including additional convictions connected to firearms and attempts to mislead investigators. Aslam was also given a prison sentence. The court found that the father and son had carefully prepared the plan, sought to bring weapons into the country, and tried to frame someone else. Betro, however, remained on the run until mid-2024. Authorities issued international arrest requests and pursued leads. In July that year, Armenian police detained her after an inquiry that involved both police cooperation and journalists. She was held there until January 2025, when she was extradited to the United Kingdom. In January, the Crown Prosecution Service confirmed charges against her. These included conspiracy to commit a planned act of harm, possession of a firearm with intent to intimidate, and illegally bringing ammunition into the country. She pleaded not guilty at an early court hearing, and her case was set for trial. The trial began in July 2025 at Birmingham Crown Court. Prosecutors presented the wide-ranging evidence. Surveillance clips were shown, phone trails and postal analysis were introduced. Witnesses included detectives, forensic experts, and others who could explain the travel and communication patterns. The prosecution told the jury that Betro had traveled from Wisconsin to the UK with the goal of carrying out the plan under Nazir's direction. The defense argued that another American woman might be the person in the surveillance footage and that the case against Betro had gaps. On August 12, 2025, the jury reached its decision. Betro was found guilty of conspiracy to take a life, possession of a firearm with intent to cause fear, and illegal importation of ammunition. Reports said she showed little visible reaction when the verdicts were announced. Prosecutors stated that the decision reflected the weight of evidence. This included the surveillance clips, the phone data, the DNA on mailed packages, the glove in the abandoned car, and the test firing footage. Her sentencing was scheduled for August 21st, 2025. Amy Betro crossed borders and used an online relationship to carry out a plan. How does someone go from a quiet life in Wisconsin to being linked to a shooting in Birmingham? Next is a woman whose veterinary access and a missing husband turned a routine life into a criminal investigation. Wendy Mae Davidson was born in 1978 in San Angelo, Texas. She grew up in a ranching community and spent much of her childhood surrounded by animals. That experience shaped her interests. She later studied veterinary medicine at Texas A&M University. After graduation, she opened a small animal clinic in San Angelo. She became a licensed veterinarian and ran the clinic while raising 2 children from previous relationships. In 2003, Davidson met Michael Severance. Severance was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Air Force. He had served multiple tours in the Middle East. Their relationship moved quickly. They married in September 2004, shortly after their child was born. The couple lived in an apartment behind Davidson's clinic. On January 15, 2005, Davidson reported that her husband was missing. She said that Severance had been anxious about another deployment. According to her, he had spoken about leaving the service. She also said he had seemed stressed and worried about how military life would affect their family. When he did not return from leave, the Air Force began an internal inquiry. Local police also opened their own missing person investigation. 2 months later, in March 2005, Severance's body was discovered in a pond on a remote ranch about 20 miles from San Angelo. The condition of the body raised immediate attention. A medical examiner's report revealed that Severance had ingested animal euthanasia substances, specifically phenobarbital and pentobarbital. The body also showed 41 puncture wounds that had been made after his passing. Investigators discovered that the body had been weighed down with more than 140 pounds of items, including a boat anchor, to keep it submerged. Police quickly focused on the possibility that the substances came from Davidson's professional access. A search of her clinic revealed records that suggested she had administered phenobarbital to an animal. Later, a witness told police that the animal's owner said this procedure had never actually taken place. Investigators also looked at her electronic records. They found internet searches and hard drive data that raised concerns about her knowledge of decomposition and disposal. These findings made it clear that someone with veterinary training had both the access to and understanding of the substance used in the poisoning. The investigation shifted when Davidson's brother spoke to authorities. He said Davidson had told him she moved Severance's body to the pond, made the puncture wounds, and then weighed it down. His statement led to Davidson's arrest in March 2005. Prosecutors presented physical evidence, the clinic records, and witness statements to support the case against her. In October 2006, Davidson entered a no-contest plea to 1 count of first-degree unlawful taking of life and 2 counts of tampering with evidence. Under the plea deal, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison on the primary charge. The 2 10-year tampering sentences were ordered to run at the same time as the main sentence. This meant her effective sentence was 25 years. Her legal team had earlier argued that a tracking device used in the inquiry had been handled improperly, but the court rejected that claim before she accepted the plea deal. After some time in county facilities, Davidson was moved into the Texas state prison system. Public records list her as an inmate in the Gatesville Lane Murray unit. Davidson has continued to say she did not cause Severance's passing. In a 2021 interview with ABC's 2020, she said, "I did not end his life. I want my side of the story, what happened. I want people to know what did and didn't happen." She admitted she made serious mistakes in how she handled the body, but denied being responsible for his passing itself. Family members responded strongly to the case and to her plea. Severance's relatives described him as a dedicated service member who had completed multiple tours overseas. They said the case left many questions, especially about motive and what really happened in the hours and days before his passing. Over the years, media coverage has emphasized both the shocking evidence and the uncertainty around motive. Some outlets have said the reason for the act has never been clear. Legally, Davidson's plea ended the case without a full jury trial on the most serious charge. A no-contest plea allowed the court to convict without her directly admitting guilt. Reports at the time noted that the plea deal left her defense team with some legal options, including the right to appeal certain rulings. In theory, a higher court could overturn parts of the case if errors were found. But so far, the conviction and sentence remain in place. Davidson has gone through periodic parole reviews. She became eligible for parole after serving part of her sentence, but her requests were denied. Records show her next parole review is scheduled for 2026. Outside of the courtroom, the case drew national attention because of Davidson's profession and the way veterinary substances were used in the act. Veterinary organizations reported on the case because of the connection between the substances and her workplace. Over the years, true crime programs and documentaries have revisited the story. They often examine the investigation, the evidence, and Davidson's statements from prison. For many who follow the case, questions remain. Why would someone use veterinary substances in this way? Why were there post-mortem puncture wounds? And what exactly led Davidson to move and conceal the body? Davidson continues to say she wants to share her side of the story. The timeline, the physical evidence, the court outcome, and the pain felt by Severance's family remain part of the public record. Up next is the story of a military household where an argument ended with a gunshot and a recording that changed the trial. If you find stories like these important, consider subscribing. Margaret E. Schaaf was born in 1993. She lived with her family on Fort Riley, Kansas. She was married to Specialist Gregory, often called Greg, Schaaf. He worked as a supply specialist with the 1st Infantry Division. Greg had joined active duty in May of 2022, after serving with the Arizona National Guard. The couple had 2 daughters. The older one was 9 years old from Margaret's earlier relationship, and the younger one was their child together, who was only 1 year old. Greg had postponed a deployment to Poland. He did this so he could remain home to help Margaret during pregnancy complications. He also wanted to stay close when their baby needed care in a neonatal intensive unit. The serious incident happened on the evening of February 19, 2024, inside the Schaaf family's home at Fort Riley. Investigators and court documents say Margaret and Greg had been arguing for some time. Both daughters, the 9-year-old and the 1-year-old, were inside the house during the argument. The situation escalated. Margaret used a firearm and fired a shot at Greg's head. He later passed away. After this, Margaret placed both children in a vehicle and drove away from the base. She left through one gate but then tried to come back. Security personnel stopped her at the entrance, and she was taken into custody. Authorities later confirmed she did not call for emergency medical help after leaving the home. Investigators reviewed Greg's phone and discovered it contained an audio recording of part of the argument. In the recording, Margaret could be heard saying she hated him and wished he would not live. The audio stopped when another soldier briefly visited the house to borrow a helmet. After that soldier left, Greg was shot while standing outside the home, according to statements investigators collected. After being taken into custody, Margaret told officials that she believed Greg had been viewing harmful online material involving children. She claimed this made her fear for the safety of her older daughter. Investigators conducted a thorough search for proof. They found no evidence that Greg had looked at or shared such material. The claim was mentioned to the jury, but it was not supported by forensic checks or other findings from the investigation. Since the incident happened on a U.S. Army base, federal authorities were in charge. The FBI and the Army Criminal Investigation Division worked with Fort Riley law enforcement. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas filed the charges and led the case. Early documents in February 2024 listed the charge as second-degree homicide. The trial took place in Topeka. Prosecutors first charged Margaret with first-degree unlawfully taking a life, which means planned and intentional. But after an 8-day trial, the jury decided on second-degree instead. That verdict was reached on February 14, 2025. In federal court, second degree means the jury found she caused Greg's passing unlawfully and with intent to harm, but not with the level of planning needed for a first-degree finding. The U.S. Attorney's Office said this conviction could bring a sentence of up to life in prison. The actual sentence will be decided later by a federal judge after a separate hearing that reviews guidelines and other factors. A status hearing was already scheduled with District Judge Toby Kraus to handle steps before sentencing. Reports showed a hearing was set for March 2025 to review procedures and scheduling. At the time of conviction, the court had not yet set a final sentencing date. During the trial, the prosecution showed the audio recording, statements from witnesses, and timelines that matched when soldiers arrived and left the home. Margaret's own statements after she was taken into custody were also part of the evidence. Defense attorneys gave their own arguments and presented points they wanted the jury to consider. But in the end, the jury concluded the prosecution had proven its case for a second-degree unlawful taking of life conviction. The case also changed family plans for the children. Reports said one of Greg's siblings intended to adopt the younger daughter. The older daughter would live with her biological father in Nebraska. Friends, teammates, and family members remembered Greg publicly. They shared how he had chosen to stay home during Margaret's health issues and described him as a father who deeply cared for his family. The military community at Fort Riley was also affected. Leaders issued brief statements. They confirmed they were cooperating with investigators. They also said they were thinking of Greg's family and the wider military unit. The involvement of the Army Criminal Investigation Division followed normal procedure for serious incidents on a military base. Cecily Aguilar grew up with a lot of instability. She was born in Michigan and entered the foster care system when she was 12. By the age of 16, she was living on her own in a park in Jackson, Michigan. Friends from that time described her as quiet and withdrawn. Her early years were marked by constant moves and very little stability. As a young adult, Aguilar moved to Guillen, Texas. There, she became involved with Aaron David Robinson, who was a U.S. Army specialist stationed at Fort Hood. At the time, Aguilar was separated from her husband, Keon Aguilar, who was also a former Fort Hood soldier. People who knew her described her relationship with Robinson as close, which placed her in the middle of the events that unfolded later. On April 22, 2020, Army specialist Vanessa Guillen disappeared from Fort Hood. Investigators later concluded that Guillen lost her life inside an armory at the base. The person responsible was Aaron Robinson. Records show that Robinson used a tool to cause her fatal injuries. Afterward, Robinson turned to Aguilar for help in covering up what had happened. She agreed to assist him. Together, they attempted to hide the remains. They burned and buried parts of them along the Leon River in central Texas. Investigators later discovered the disposal sites during the search. Guillen's disappearance launched a large search and a wide federal investigation. Her family and supporters pushed for answers, which drew national attention. 2 months later, on June 30, 2020, human remains connected to the case were found along the Leon River. Law enforcement quickly focused on suspects. Robinson fled when the remains were discovered. The next day, on July 1, 2020, he ended his own life when officers attempted to detain him. Aguilar was taken into custody on June 30, after admitting that she helped Robinson hide the remains. Because the events happened on a military base and involved military personnel, federal investigators handled the case. The charges against Aguilar were extensive. She was indicted on multiple counts related to tampering, destruction of records, helping after the fact, and giving false statements. Eventually, Aguilar and prosecutors reached a plea agreement. In November 2022, she admitted guilt in federal court. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of being an accessory after the fact and 3 counts of making false statements to federal investigators. Prosecutors described Aguilar's role as active and intentional. They said she helped Robinson conceal the remains and then misled investigators. Some of her statements to law enforcement did not match physical evidence or other witness accounts. In court, Aguilar admitted that she provided false information and that she helped with disposing of the remains. On August 14, 2023, a federal judge sentenced Cecily Aguilar to 30 years in prison. This was the maximum prison term allowed under federal law for the charges she admitted to. The sentence also included the possibility of supervised release and fines. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Texas announced the sentence publicly. Officials said the punishment reflected Aguilar's admitted role in hiding evidence and providing false information. They also said it recognized the harm caused to Vanessa Guillen's family. Diane Michelle Zamora was born in 1978 in Crowley, Texas. This was a small suburb in Tarrant County, near Fort Worth. She grew up in a household that valued discipline, education, and achievement. Teachers and friends described her as intelligent and focused. From a young age, she excelled in school and often earned the highest grades. Her academic success eventually took her to the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland after high school. This was a major accomplishment because admission to the academy is highly competitive. It requires congressional nomination, excellent academic records, leadership skills, and strong physical fitness. Zamora planned to pursue a career in the military. Her drive and ambition stood out even as a teenager. Her fiancé, David Graham, was also high-achieving. He was born in 1978 as well. Graham was focused on aviation and gained admission into the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Like Zamora, he was gifted in academics, athletic, and seen as a future leader. The two first met in their early teens through the Civil Air Patrol. This is a program that promotes aviation education, emergency services, and youth leadership. At 14 years old, they became friends. By August of 1995, when they were 17, they started dating seriously. Their relationship developed quickly. Within months, they announced their engagement. This surprised many, since they were young and about to enter demanding careers. Less than 4 months after their engagement, events unfolded that changed their lives forever. According to court testimony, Graham admitted to Zamora that he had been involved in an encounter with Adrian Jones, a 16-year-old student and track athlete from Mansfield, Texas. Adrian was popular in her community. Friends described her as energetic, kind, and talented in sports. She had a promising future, and her sudden loss deeply affected Mansfield. When Graham confessed to what happened, Zamora reportedly reacted with anger and jealousy. Prosecutors later said she was desperate to maintain control of the relationship. Zamora allegedly told Graham that Adrian needed to be removed from their lives in order to purify their bond. Together, they formed a plan. On the night of December 4th, 1995, Graham contacted Adrian and invited her to meet. He picked her up in his car. Zamora was hiding in the hatchback. They drove to a quiet area near Joe Pool Lake, a reservoir in Grand Prairie, Texas. At the lake, Zamora confronted Adrian and accused her of being involved with Graham, Witnesses later testified that Zamora struck Adrienne with a dumbbell weight, injuring her. Adrienne tried to run, but Graham pursued her. He then fired a handgun twice, ending Adrienne's life. The pair tried to cover their tracks. They got rid of clothing, cleaned Graham's car, and returned to their academy routines. For a time, the case remained unsolved, and Adrienne's passing was seen as a mystery. The investigation began right after Adrienne was found near Joe Pool Lake. Detectives searched for leads but had no clear suspects at first. Adrienne was known as a well-regarded student and athlete, which left investigators unsure why anyone would want to hurt her. The break in the case came from Zamora herself. In 1996, while attending the Naval Academy, she confided in her roommates about what had happened. Different accounts exist about why she spoke up. Some say it was guilt, others say it was pressure, and some say she was showing off. Whatever the reason, her words concerned her roommates enough that they reported her to Academy officials. Naval officials contacted law enforcement in Texas. Investigators quickly connected the confession to Adrienne Jones's unsolved case. On September 6, 1996, Zamora and Graham were both arrested. During questioning, both admitted to their involvement at first. They each gave statements that pointed to themselves and to each other. Later, they tried to take back these statements, but their original confessions became crucial for the prosecution. Combined with supporting evidence, these admissions gave prosecutors the foundation for charges. Zamora's trial began in February 1998 in Fort Worth, Texas. The case drew heavy media attention. The press highlighted the contrast between Zamora's achievements and her alleged actions. The story of two Academy students taking such extreme steps for a teenage relationship made national headlines. The prosecution argued that Zamora's jealousy drove the plan. They pointed to her confession to her roommates, her role in planning, and her active confrontation with Adrienne. They described her as controlling and influencing Graham into destructive behavior. Key evidence included confession statements from both Zamora and Graham, testimony from Naval Academy roommates, forensic evidence linking Graham's weapon to Adrienne, and accounts of the couple's intense relationship. Zamora's defense argued that Graham was the true instigator. They claimed Zamora was manipulated, overwhelmed, and lacked the strength to resist him. They tried to portray her as a young woman under the influence of a dominant partner, but the evidence weighed against her. After more than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Diane Zamora guilty of capital charges. On February 18, 1998, she received a life sentence. Under Texas law at the time, life imprisonment required serving at least 40 years before being considered for parole. David Graham was tried separately. His trial followed a similar path. Prosecutors emphasized that he was the one who fired the shots. Graham was also convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Although prosecutors highlighted their roles differently, both were found equally responsible for what happened to Adrienne Jones. After her conviction, Zamora was sent to the Dr. Lane Murray Unit, a women's facility in Gatesville, Texas. As of 2025, she is still there. Over the years, she has continued to say she was pressured into participating. She has claimed her role was exaggerated and that Graham was the true mastermind, but every appeal has been denied. Graham, meanwhile, is serving his sentence in a men's facility under the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He will not be eligible for parole until at least 2036. The two have lived separate lives since their convictions. Stacy D. Kelly and her husband, Brandon M. Kelly, lived on Fort Stewart Military Reservation in Liberty County, Georgia. Brandon was an enlisted soldier stationed on the base. Stacy was a civilian spouse. Together, they raised their young daughter, Violet Kelly. Fort Stewart is one of the largest U.S. Army installations. It is home to the 3rd Infantry Division. Life on a military base can provide stability for families, but it also brings its own pressures. Soldiers face long schedules, deployments, and the demands of military culture. Spouses often deal with isolation, frequent moves, and the challenges of adjusting to military life. Within this setting, the Kellys tried to live as a young family. From the outside, their home appeared similar to many others on base. Brandon focused on his duties as a soldier. Stacy cared for the household and their daughter. But in late 2024, events inside their home drew the attention of federal authorities and soon became a matter of national concern. According to a federal indictment, the period between October and November of that year was critical in the life of their daughter, Violet. Prosecutors alleged that during this time, Stacy and Brandon did not provide her with enough food and failed to seek proper medical care. Authorities later determined that Violet's passing was connected to malnutrition and untreated health problems. Under federal law, such conditions are treated not only as neglect, but also as serious offenses if they lead to a loss of life. Prosecutors believe this was not a single event. Instead, they say it was a prolonged pattern of deprivation over nearly a month. The Justice Department called the allegations heartbreaking. Acting U.S. Attorney Tara M. Lyons stressed how serious the charges were. She said that the loss of a child in this way was heartbreaking on many levels. Her statement reflected both the legal weight of the case and the emotional toll on investigators, prosecutors, and the community. When Violet passed away, the situation was immediately reported to military officials at Fort Stewart. Because it happened on a military base, the U.S. Army Criminal Investigative Division, known as CID, led the inquiry. CID investigates felony-level offenses within Army jurisdiction including cases involving dependence on military property. Agents from CID reviewed medical findings, interviewed witnesses, and gathered health and care records. Their investigation suggested that Violet's passing was not sudden. Instead, evidence indicated she had been denied proper nutrition and medical treatment for weeks. CID shared its results with federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Georgia. Since the events took place on federal land, the U.S. government had authority over the case. After reviewing the evidence, the U.S. Attorney's Office presented the case to a federal grand jury. On August 8, 2025, the grand jury unsealed an indictment against Stacy and Brandon Kelly. The indictment included several charges. One was felony loss of life, claiming the child's passing occurred during another felony, which was the deprivation of food and medical care. Two additional counts were second-degree loss of life, which alleged that their actions showed disregard for human life, even if not planned in advance. These are among the most serious charges in federal law. A conviction can bring a sentence of life in prison. In the federal system, parole does not exist. A life sentence means spending the rest of one's life in custody, unless the sentence is reduced through appeal or commutation. The indictment also highlights how cases on military property differ from those in state courts. Federal courts follow stricter sentencing rules, with fewer options for early release. As of August 2025, Stacy and Brandon Kelly remain in custody without bond as they await trial. Federal judges can deny bond if the defendants are seen as flight risks or if the charges are especially severe. In cases involving loss of life, release before trial is rare. The couple is currently held in federal custody, most likely at a detention facility for pretrial inmates under the supervision of the U.S. Marshals Service. Both are waiting for further hearings while the pretrial process continues. This stage involves both sides exchanging evidence, filing motions, and preparing for trial. The discovery process may include medical records, expert medical reports, testimony from doctors, and documents from the Kelly household. Prosecutors are expected to rely heavily on expert testimony to argue that the child's condition resulted directly from neglect. The defense may argue that her passing was accidental or due to health problems outside the parent's control. They may also challenge whether prosecutors can prove intent or reckless disregard. If the case goes to trial, it will take place in federal court in the Southern District of Georgia. A jury will decide whether the government has proven the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors will need to show that the neglect was severe enough to cause the loss of life and that it legally qualifies as homicide. If convicted, Stacy and Brandon Kelly face life imprisonment without parole. In federal sentencing, the judge considers guidelines, legal penalties, and other factors. Aggravating factors could include the young age of the child and the length of the alleged neglect. Mitigating factors might involve the parent's mental health, past records, or personal circumstances.